Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Oliver Hartwig. I'm a research fellow here at the Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our lecture tonight. Our guest tonight is Jacob Levy. Jacob is a political scientist from Montreal, from McGill University in Montreal. And first of all, before we say anything else, I have to thank him actually for giving this talk here to us tonight, because he's only just arrived at 9 o'clock this morning all the way from Montreal. So you can imagine how he feels. But so we're really grateful that you made it to the Center to share with us your thoughts on Hayek. Now, we at the Center are, of course, as you can see in the background, great fans of Friedrich August von Hayek. And in fact, we have published quite a lot of his works and quite a lot of essays on his work. The latest one, actually, the multi-layered Hayek, which you can get after the lecture. But Hayek is, of course, a philosopher, an economist, a thinker. It's notoriously difficult to understand. He always needs an interpreter. And as Jacob is going to argue tonight, Hayek probably sometimes even needed an interpreter to understand himself better. What Jacob is going to argue tonight is that Hayek was looking at the history of liberal philosophy and liberal economic thought through his own lens, through the lens of the 1940s and 50s, and was trying to find people in history, in the history of liberal thought, who he regarded as kind of precursors to his own thought. And in doing so, he often confused what these earlier liberal thinkers really sometimes meant. And I think it will be fascinating to hear Jacob's insights into Hayek's thoughts and where Hayek was right and where Hayek probably should have consulted another interpreter. So, with that introduction, I'm very happy to introduce now Jacob Levy, who is, as I said, a political scientist from McGill University, who holds a PhD in politics from Princeton and a Master's of Law from the University of Chicago Law School. And as I mentioned, he's a Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory at McGill in Montreal and the author of Multiculturalism of Fear, the co-editor of Colonialism and Its Legacies, and the author of numerous articles on federalism, constitutional theory, multiculturalism, and the history of liberal thought. Apart from that, he's an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, our friends in the United States, and he's a former Fulbright scholar at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and as he told me, he spent more than a year in Canberra for that a few years ago. So with that introduction, welcome to the Center, and we look forward to hearing from you. Welcome, Fredrik.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It is a real pleasure to be back here. It is the first time I've been to the Center in 17 years. I hope it will be less time than that before my return. As Oliver said, I've flown in relatively recently. I've been on flights or in transit for some 25 of the last 35 hours. So if I nod off while I'm standing here, someone just nudge me. The ultimate aim of my talk tonight is to bring out some issues in liberal and particularly in classical liberal theory about how we think about economics and politics at the same time. And I hope to illuminate some trade-offs and conflicts that might otherwise be obscure. But I'm going to get there by way of talking about the work of Friedrich Hayek. I'll begin with a relatively famous story and a bit quoted directly from Hayek, and then move on to some less famous bits and pieces. The relatively famous story. The Mont Pelerin Society, the organization of free market and classical liberal academics, primarily economists, that Hayek convened in 1947 in an attempt to restore and reinvigorate the study of the ideas of freedom and the free society in the wake of the catastrophe that had just preceded. The Mont Pelerin Society was named after the Swiss resort where it was held, where the first meeting was held. But Hayek's proposal for what the society should be named was not Mont Pelerin. He first proposed that it be named the Acton-Tocqueville Society. Tocqueville being, of course, Alexis de Tocqueville, the French political scientist and political theorist of the 19th century, and Acton being Lord Acton, the British Whig historian of the 19th century. Now, the famous part of the story that Hayek related much later is that his proposal was torpedoed by the great University of Chicago economist Frank Knight, who objected that a liberal organization, an organization devoted to liberal ideas, could not possibly be named after two Catholics, both aristocrats, no less. And that was the end of that. Something that I think gets hidden in that story as Hayek tells it is the oddity of the proposal in the first place. The Mont Pelerin Society, as it persists to this day, is still more than anything else an international society of free market-oriented economists. It's not only that, but it's that more than it is anything else. And you will read far and wide in Tocqueville and Acton before you find much discussion of economics, and farther and wider still before you find much discussion of economics that is in any way particularly sophisticated or interesting. Economic questions were not at the core of Tocqueville's or Acton's interests. They were concerned with, as the Mont Pelerin scholars would have it, the free society. They were clearly liberals. But what was it precisely that Hayek thought this society he was forming owed in its debt to Acton and Tocqueville in particular? I now want to read a bit from the Constitution of Liberty. As a result, we have had to the present day two different traditions in the theory of liberty, one empirical and unsystematic, the other speculative and rationalistic. The first based on an interpretation of traditions and institutions which had spontaneously grown up but were imperfectly understood. The second, aiming at the construction of a utopia which has often been tried but never successfully. Nevertheless, it has been the rationalistic, plausible, and apparently logical argument of the French tradition, with its flattering assumptions about the unlimited powers of human reason, that has progressively gained influence, while the less articulate and less explicit tradition of English freedom has been on the decline. And after a momentary qualification about the accuracy of the French and English national descriptors for the two traditions, Hayek says it was in the end the victory of the Benthamite philosophical radicals over the Whigs in England that concealed the fundamental difference which in more recent years has reappeared as the conflict between liberal democracy and social or totalitarian democracy. Those last few words are, I think, an uncharacteristic moment of rhetorical excess for Hayek. The equation of social democracy with totalitarianism is something that's quite different from Hayek's famous dedication of the road to serfdom to socialists of all parties. That by the 1950s, Hayek would say that social democracy as such had something deeply in common with totalitarianism was an unfortunate conflation of ideas, and one that might be connected with some of the conflations that I'll be talking about further. Now, those two traditions of liberty that Hayek discussed and that he spends one whole chapter of the Constitution of Liberty and then recurring moments in the rest of the Constitution of Liberty discussing, those two traditions will be familiar in some shape to anyone who has much familiarity with Hayek's thought at all. The idea that a society is self-ordering, the idea that what we see in a social order are spontaneously emerging phenomena, and that freedom consists in some substantial part of respecting and allowing to be free those spontaneous self-ordering parts of a social order. That, of course, is Hayek's own view. It is one of Hayek's master ideas. And the critique of the second tradition, the critique of the idea that a social order is knowable in its entirety, that it could be rationally designed, that is central to his critique of socialist economics from the 1930s and remains a dominant, and I think becomes an increasingly dominant theme in his social thought as a whole in the post-war era. Hayek eventually becomes famous as a theorist of the limits of what human reason can know about complex orders. He's someone who understands, before a great deal of the rest of social science, the idea of emergent orders as being complex phenomena that are not reducible to a couple of simple premises, but that have nonetheless very strongly ordered characteristics of their own. And he thinks that what I'll call emergent phenomena are not knowable in their entirety. And when you try to know them in their entireties, and certainly when you try to construct them, you are going to misunderstand them and break them. So there we have a short statement of Hayek's account of two traditions of thinking about liberty, one of which is the precursors to Hayek's own thought, and the other of which is the precursor to what he considers to be a deep fallacy, a fallacy that he tells us in the passage ultimately results in totalitarianism. It is the fallacy of the planned order. In Hayek's own thought, the planned order is fundamentally a mistake of economics first. In his famous article on the uses of information in society, while he offers a general statement about what it is to have knowledge and information about a social order, and how it is that decentralized, disaggregated information can sometimes get a more accurate picture of what's happening in a social order than information which could even conceivably be known all in one place at one time. The examples that he gives, besides a few quick references to language, the examples that he gives are all examples drawn from the price system. The price system is the example par excellence of a way in which information that is decentralized and disaggregated gets moved from where it is to where it has to be, and the economic order that arises out of a freely operating price system, the free market order, is the example par excellence of an emergent order that needs to be left alone, because failing to leave it alone means that you are committing what he will come to describe as the rationalistic constructivist fallacy of thinking that you can know more than you can actually know about the workings of a complex system. Now, Hayek, over the course of an intellectual career that spanned more than half a century, applied this idea in what I'm going to describe as at least 4 distinct domains. The idea of the difference between the emergent order with its complex informational structure and the planned order with its presumption of complete knowability from outside. The first, and I think always the paradigmatic one, is the economic model. The difference between a market order, a free market society, an economy in which spontaneous economic orders emerged, and a planned economy in which state officials purported to know where resources needed to be and when. The second, and one that I'm not going to talk about after I mention it right now, is in his work on the philosophy of mind. Hayek did important work on scientific knowledge about what the mind could actually know, work that is still relevant in neurology and psychology today, but work on which I have no ability to comment in any sophisticated fashion. But there, too, his concern was with saying, the human mind cannot know everything about itself. There is a more complex phenomenon there than can be wholly extracted and understood from within the phenomenon itself. The third domain is the domain of law. In a number of works later in life, and I think most importantly in Volume 1 of the trilogy Law, Legislation, and Liberty, Hayek talked in a very sophisticated way about the difference between legal orders as being centrally planned and posited from above, and legal orders as being spontaneous or emergent phenomena. The distinction is between what he calls grown law. Think of common law based on precedent arising out of case after case after case, and legislation, which is planned law, directed law. Someone has to sit down and write down the whole law from beginning to end. And Hayek was deeply concerned to argue, at least, that grown law was a kind of law, a species of law, and that we should not commit the fallacy of thinking that only legislation was law. And in the event, Hayek was, of course, concerned to argue more than that, to say that grown law is in many ways and for many purposes a superior or more attractive kind of legal order to be preferred over the modern growth of the legislative state. And then the fourth domain is the domain of politics and constitutional orders. In Hayek's writings toward the end of World War II and for several years thereafter, we start to find references to Lord Acton creeping in and then becoming an important theme in his work. The proposal to name a scholarly society after Acton and Tocqueville, it turns out, does not originate with the Mont Pelerin Society. It was instead an idea that he had first offered in a proposal in 1944 to English historians about how they could form a post-war society that included German historians. Before the war had yet ended, making an argument within English academia about the need to have Europe-wide intellectual and scholarly societies devoted to the study of freedom and liberal ideas. That would include Germans as part of the post-war reconstructive order. But in this case, addressed not to economists but to historians. Acton, he says, would be a particularly attractive person after whom to name such a society for a couple of reasons. One, as it were, looking forward to Frank Knight's objection years later. One is that Acton was a Catholic. And he thought the liberal resistance to Nazi rule in Germany had overrepresented Catholics, because Catholics, uniquely among Germans, had a very strong allegiance an entity that could not be reduced to the German nation state. And that German Catholics, because they were concerned to protect the freedom of the church, had a very strong institutional bias against reducing everything in German society to the nation state. This wasn't only a matter of the coincidence that German Catholics thought something and Lord Acton was a Catholic. This was also central to Acton's own thought. The maintenance of the distinction between church and state, and the protection of church from state, was, on Acton's own telling, one of the crucial pieces of the emergence of the modern idea of freedom. Acton was a devoted and partisan liberal within English politics, eventually elevated to the House of Lords by the Liberal Prime Minister William Gladstone, and was also a very active participant in Catholic affairs. He was a strong opponent of ultramontanism. He was a strong opponent of the movement in the late 19th century toward papal centralization, the movement that eventually culminated in the last decades of the 19th century with the announcement of the doctrine of papal infallibility. Acton was, in religion and in politics, a federalist. He considered federalism to be the supreme discovery of modern politics, the discovery that could allow for the maintenance of freedom. Because federalism allowed for a plurality of levels of authority. Within the church, he argued for a federalist structure in which the centralist king in Rome would not have unilateral say. Within politics, he argued for federalist structures wherein the capital city would never have complete unilateral say. And as between church and state, he argued for an analog of federalism, whereby people would not choose one or the other, but rather would live with the experience of the complexity and pluralism of having allegiances to multiple kinds of authorities at the same time. And this, he thought, would be one of the ways that the primary threat to freedom that he, Acton, saw emerging in modernity would be prevented. What is that primary threat? That primary threat is the elevation of the state that was going to happen in an era of democracy and nationalism. When you have state power that is deeply moralized by the advent of democracy, by people's enthusiasm for saying that what the state has announced is the will of the people, and when the people starts to gain the very strong emotional and affective identity that is nationalism, then Acton feared we were going to see an irresistible concentration of power. Acton famously is the author of the phrase that power tends to corrupt, absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely, and this was an animating idea throughout his career. And he thought that the modern era was going to see an unparalleled concentration of power in the democratic nation state, and that anything that tended to fragment people's social identities and sources of social authority was an attractive feature because it would tend to weaken or diminish that trend. This meant religious pluralism within the state. It meant that some of the religious bodies within the state should have a strong authority to which they looked. It meant multinationalism within a state, the Habsburg Empire rather than the nation states which were to succeed it. In that description that I just gave, the fear that in modernity we would have a new concentration of power as the state combined with a rising tide of democracy, that was Alexis de Tocqueville's great fear of modernity as well. Tocqueville, like Acton, was a dedicated modern. neither looked back to the Middle Ages or to pre-democratic eras with nostalgia, but both thought that there was a grave threat to individual freedom arising from this combination: the new state power and the new commitment to democracy as a moral statement. Not simply democracy as a procedure, but democracy as the announcement of the voice of the people, which has an irresistible moral claim to be obeyed. Where Acton emphasized federalist structures and relations between church and state as the ways to stave off this threat, Tocqueville, famously in Volume 2 of Democracy in America, hoped that voluntary associations, what we now call the sphere of civil society, could do much of that work. But in voluntary associations, too, we have competing spheres of authority. We have organizations to which people belong that are not the state, and that have purposes of their own that the democratic state might frustrate or fail to fulfill. And so, as a member of a voluntary association, I will have something that has purchase on my mind that is not simply the majoritarian nation state. It will give me a place to stand with which to oppose the centralizing modern democratic nation state. In Acton and Tocqueville both, then, we see a resistance to the centralizing tendencies of the modern rationalistic state. We see a commitment to preventing states from becoming the kinds of things that think that they can plan whole social orders, and to plan them in very unitary, structured ways. But in neither Tocqueville nor Acton does that have very much at all to do with economics. The pluralism that Acton and Tocqueville both embraced was a pluralism about constitutional structures, about the division of authority and power within the state. That was an idea to which Hayek was also committed. And in looking forward to a post-war order, Hayek believed, first, that it was of course going to be unacceptable for Germany ever again to be a unitary nation state. But second, that it was unacceptable to envision, as some of his English friends did, the permanent subjection and isolation of Germany. And so Hayek looked toward a federalized, pluralistic, decentralized Germany within a federalized, pluralistic European order. A Europe of nation states was unacceptable because it would demand that Germany be a nation state as well, and was undesirable because nation states as such are undesirable for Actonian reasons. A pluralistic order, a federalistic order of Europe as a whole and of the states within Europe would prevent that idolization, that idolatry of the nation state. And it would allow for the reintegration of Germany into a European order without being Germany in the same way that it had been. Now, this could be thought of as something that was of particular psychological importance to Hayek, who was, of course, Austrian himself, but through his adult life, even the decades that he spent in the United States, said that England was where he always felt most at home. In hoping for a reconciliation of English and German intellectual life in particular, we certainly see Hayek making a statement about the world that he has an emotional stake in bringing about. But it's also not bad as political prognosis. It's clearly going to be, it's not sustainable to try to do what the Treaty of Versailles did and allow Germany to still be Germany but try to prevent it from being the warmongering center. It's unacceptable to depopulate and deindustrialize Germany, as some Britons were proposing. This is the way forward, so far as Hayek is concerned. It can be led by scholars who will restore German liberals to a place of honor among liberals. But it must, in the end, give us a European order in which Germany will be a member without being a threat. Acton and Tocqueville were in their way both historians. To say to a society of historians that in order to join together English and German historians, they should look to Acton in particular. Acton, who was part German by ancestry and partly educated in Germany, and a great contributor to methodological debates in history with German scholars. That's to say, there's a figure in common between these two disciplines. That Hayek happened to still have the idea in mind 3 years later when he attends Mont Pelerin. Seems to be one of those cases where when you have an idea that seems like a good idea, you don't want to let go of it just because the moment has passed. You have your solution and you will apply it to a new problem rather than the problem for which it was originally designed. But by the time of the Constitution of Liberty, we are starting, I think, to see Hayek run together the rationalism-pluralism problem in constitutional government with the rationalism and spontaneity problem in economics. In that passage that I read from Constitution of Liberty, he identifies whole intellectual traditions, one of them as being concerned with spontaneous order as such, and the other being universally committed to the supremacy of human reason and to implausibly grandiose claims about what can be known and what can be planned. And he goes on over the course of that chapter to run together figures like Tocqueville and Acton with figures like Adam Smith. We'll talk about Smith for a second. Smith, who it is, I think, surprising not to hear mentioned in a proposal to name the Mont Pelerin Society after scholars of years past. Smith was certainly a theorist of what Hayek is going to come to understand as spontaneous order. Smith sees the economic sphere within society as being, under certain conditions, self-ordering and emergent. More than anyone else, Smith put into the general stream of European social thought the idea that orders could emerge as if guided by an invisible hand, rather than by being deliberately planned by someone with information at their disposal. But that does not mean that Smith was the kind of theorist about the state that Acton and Tocqueville were. And indeed, I think he was not. Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations is one of the first great statements in the history of European political and social thought about what the modern state is and what the modern state does. And it is not written in a tone of fearfulness. Smith sees the growth of the European state in the 18th century, the British state in particular, but not the British state only, just the British state was getting there first, sees the growth of the European state as being something that can protect freedom. Over the course of The Wealth of Nations, Smith had provided, yes, a critique of mercantilism in the international sphere, but also very strongly a critique of the power that corporate subgroups held within the European economic order. The guild system, the system of masters and apprentices, and the system of the Old English poor law in which the individual parish can say that people can't move in search of work because they might be impoverished vagrants. Those are kinds of decentralization. Those are ways in which the English economic order was ruled by bodies that were much smaller than the state. I may not enter a trade unless a master has authorized me after an apprenticeship. I may not enter a profession unless the guild has admitted me as a member, and I may not enter a region looking for work unless the local parish council has given me permission for that. And Smith sees the growth of the modern European state as something that can check all of those local threats to freedom. The market order that Smith sees as possibly emerging is an order that can only emerge when the state successfully checks the powers of those local, decentralized, pluralistic groups. That's not to say that's all Smith thought about the state, and Smith does have other moments in which he talks about the limits of state planning in constitutional orders as such. But Smith's view about the relation between state and intermediate groups is much more ambivalent than anything that we're going to see out of Acton and Tocqueville. We see no evidence of that, I think, in Hayek's Hybrid. Hayek is an heir of Acton and Tocqueville in politics, and he is an heir of Adam Smith in economics. Because on Hayek's own worldview, one in which problems of information and knowledge and planning are the central problems to solve, because on Hayek's own worldview, those ideas went together. He looked to the past and assembled his list of heroes and his list of villains based on whether they had an idea in common with one or another of his commitments to spontaneous order across law and economics and politics. But that doesn't actually mean that those thinkers would have been on the same side of the disputes that were of great concern to them. What it means rather, and this is a legitimate thing for Hayek to be interested in, what it means rather is Hayek had things that he could learn from each of them and all of them. But that doesn't make for an intellectual camp or school or tradition. It tells us something interesting about Hayek's own intellectual development, not about the history of liberal thought. And as we look to carry the ideas, the study of freedom and of free societies forward, we need to be willing to step back from Hayek's own understanding of what ideas went together to look for possible moments of conflict. Now, this is something that some of Hayek's contemporaries within the classical liberal tradition tried, more or less unsuccessfully, to argue with him during his lifetime. James Buchanan in particular, another classical liberal Nobel Prize-winning economist, Buchanan openly said that he thought Hayek misunderstood and failed to appreciate the ways that rationalist constructivism, deliberate decisions and accumulations of information in one place, could make real contributions to freedom. Buchanan's central concern is with constitutional orders. And Buchanan thinks that you will get a free society only if you get the constitutional rules right in the first place. The idea of getting the Constitution right in the first place, which means the idea that you have a Constitution that you enact at a moment in time. That's, well, the American idea of constitutions and not the English. But Buchanan thinks that you need to have that American idea, an idea that I think is recognizably social contractarian in form. We have constitutions because we come together at a moment in time, decide what the rules are, and bind ourselves to them. That is a moment of planning. It's a moment of thinking that we know the answers all at once. It's a complex multi-level moment of planning because you leave open what will happen freely within the order that follows. But it's still a moment of planning. It says that even if Hayek's idealized history of England is true as a history of England, it can't be true about where we're going to get freedom from as a general matter. That England happened to be lucky and evolve the institutions of a free society doesn't tell us what to do in the rest of the world where it didn't come about spontaneously over the course of 1,000 years, or so Buchanan argued. I want to push on the tension from the other direction. Economic freedom, as classical liberals understand it, is not itself always, maybe not ever, a spontaneously emergent phenomenon. Smith thought that you needed to plan policy. You needed to make structured legislative decisions to override local concentrations of power, local inefficient evolutions, and free up an economic order as a whole. And other free market economists from outside the Austrian tradition, free market economists from the school that's associated with the University of Chicago, free market economists associated with international institutions like the IMF, are routinely in the business of saying, we know what the rules need to be. And we know that we need to get them more or less all at once. Hayek was a methodological critic of the direction that modern economics was taking. He thought that he saw rationalism in his negative sense taking over the economic profession. He thought that this had been true since roughly the time of John Stuart Mill, and that it had continued and become only more pernicious over time. Maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong about the perniciousness. But he was right about the degree to which modern economics is, in his sense, a rationalistic discipline. And he failed, I think, to see the degree to which market orders would also be associated with rationalistic exercises of power. The political scientist James Scott at Yale, who's written an extremely important book in social theory called Seeing Like a State, which draws on Hayek, is a great theorist of spontaneously emergent orders and a critic of state-ordered centralized planning. And he is deeply unsympathetic to the market tradition in economics. In his earlier work, before Seeing Like a State, one of the things that Scott had written about over and over again was the way that the colonial state, take, for example, a case that Scott had written about at great length, the French colonial state in Vietnam, imposed something like a modern market economy in order to make its task of being a state easier. To take the simplest example of why, states tax. That's not true of all forms of political organization in all of human history. Medieval political institutions, by and large, didn't tax, they expected service in kind. But the modern state taxes. It expects fungible currency to come in with which it can buy its armed forces and the other things that states like to buy. How do you get cash out of a non-cash peasant economy? You use coercive power in order to say, our tax collectors are going to come. You need to have cash to give them. If you fail to have cash to give them, then we are going to treat you the way that we treat lawbreakers. And that coercively reorders the underlying peasant economy. It forces small-holding peasants into plantation systems in which they can do work that will be remunerated with cash rather than being individual subsistence farmers or communal subsistence farmers. So you get the imposition of a modern economy through the tool of the tax-collecting state, but creating the cash-based economy that we now know. That interaction of something like a capitalist order with something like state power, that's something that Scott's written about in many times in many places. And it's something that is evident even in the emergence of the market economy in Britain itself. Adam Smith's great work is an inquiry into the causes, into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And the nation there means what it sounds like it means. There are crucial arguments over the course of the wealth of nations about how it is that states, the British state in particular, can grow in fiscal and military power. And free trade and the modern market economic order are the ways that states can be wealthy enough that they can afford to do the things that Smith foresees the modern state will have to do. States that fail to be market-oriented economies will fail to be viable competitors in the state system. There's an alliance that we can see over and over again when we step back from the Hayekian worldview and look for conflicts. There's an alliance that we can see between the market order and state power. That doesn't mean that's all there is to the story. But it means that Hayek is telling us an account that's going to blind us to the possibility. Planned orders will sometimes be market orders. The market order obviously isn't planned in all its detail. If you have a central planner telling everyone what to produce and where to work, then you no longer have a market. But the creation of a market economy as a whole is sometimes something that states do deliberately. And if they don't do it, then you might well have economic orders that are not market orders, or that are only interstitially market orders. You can have local communities that have communal land holdings, communal subsistence farming, guilds managing trades that might buy and sell on a market between them, but that are internally something very different from market societies. The way that modern economics has become a rationalistic discipline is, I think, compatible with that fact. Modern economics, originally called political economy in the 18th and early 19th century, was a way to describe what political societies needed to do with their economies in order to make them something like markets. It was not a discipline that taught about the simple, spontaneous evolution of markets, even if, as in Smith's case, it was committed to there being spontaneous orders emerging within markets. And so in an analysis of economics and state power, the discipline of political economy, from long before John Stuart Mill's time, was a discipline that could see markets being imposed by state power and markets as enhancing state power. Conversely, if, like Acton and Tocqueville, we're worried about the excesses of state power, if, for that matter, like the Friedrich Hayek of 1944, we're worried about the nation-state as such and the concentration and centralization of power in the war-making nation-state, then we will not automatically or necessarily be market liberals, or not only market liberals. We will sometimes worry that the decision to move to a market liberal order will be a move that will empower the nation state and its war-making capacity that we're treating as the central object of concern. I do not aim tonight to offer resolutions of those tensions. I aim only to draw out the ways that Hayek gave answers to two different sets of questions that he then treated as the same answer, and to say, in the kinds of conflicts that we may face in thinking about free societies now and in the future, we have to be willing and able to see that those answers might come into conflict.